So this is a session in which I'm hoping to blow your minds. That's my aim, my modest aim. When you just see just how clever Jesus is. Well, actually, you can't ever see the full extent of Jesus' cleverness, but you'll see he's pretty smart. Because we've looked at the parable of the two sons, and we've seen it's a simple story. It's got a lot going on. It's very economical with words. And it's also challenging the scribes who think they know the Old Testament, and Jesus is using an Old Testament story to probe them morally about their own greed. Because what we have in that context is the scribes and the Pharisees really don't like the fact that the tax collectors and sinners are accessing Jesus. And so there is an alignment between the older brother and the scribes and the Pharisees, who are resenting the younger brother, who is the wayward person, a bit like tax collectors and sinners were wayward. But there's more echo to the Old Testament, not just the story of Jacob and Esau. There's also the story of Jacob and Laban. And particularly when you get to the second section of the story. So the first 62% is about the younger brother, and then the final 38% is about the older brother. And as you get towards that final 38% about the older brother, you find lots of references to Laban kick in, whether it's the older brother coming and hearing music and dancing, which is a bit like Laban saying he wanted to send his daughters away with music. Then the older brother is angry, and we see in the story of Jacob and Laban how Jacob get angry. But the most striking of all of these comparisons is this one, where the older brother says to his father, "All these years I have served you, I have slaved for you." This is, of course, just what Jacob said to Laban. "I've worked these 20 years for you, earning your daughters." Then the older brother talks about his younger brother having devoured. The word is devour or eat. Eaten your property with prostitutes. That word, to eat property, to devour property, is exactly the phrase that Laban's daughters used of how he devoured their property. Then the father turns and says to the older brother, "All that is mine is yours," which is literally true. And of course, Laban said, "All you see is mine." But there's a bit more going on, because of course, both Jacob and the younger brother were people who had initially worked for no pay. Remember how at first Jacob worked for no pay. It was only later that payment was agreed with Laban. And there are similarities. There's a younger brother herding in a foreign country for nothing. Now, what I find interesting is, though, it's not just the story of Jacob and Esau and some references to Laban. It's also the story of Joseph, which is referenced here. You see, when the younger brother comes back, the father says, "Quick, put a ring on his finger and bring out the best robe." Well, the only time in the entire Bible that someone quickly gets a ring and a new robe is when Joseph suddenly is brought out of prison, and then Pharaoh appoints him to that important position of the right-hand man under Pharaoh. Suddenly, he's brought to be number 2 in Egypt. And it's almost as if this son, this younger son, is suddenly brought to be number 2 in the family. It's a very, very striking thing that's going on. And of course, there's another link with the Joseph story. That is the phrase great famine. It's not a common phrase in the Bible. There are great famines in the time of Joseph and in this story. These are the only 2 stories of moving from rags to riches instantly that we have in the Bible. Of course, Daniel gets a sudden promotion, but he wasn't in prison before that. These are the only 2 cases. But more strikingly, we have despite there's a little parallel, like no one giving the prodigal anything and Joseph giving everyone food, the most striking thing is this. Joseph also went into a far country and his father thought he was dead. There's only one other son in the Bible who is dead and alive again, lost and is found. This is what Jacob says about Joseph. Jacob looks at the robe dipped in blood and says, it's my son's robe. An evil animal has devoured him. And then he says later, when he hears his son is alive, Joseph, my son is alive, I will go and see him before I die. In other words, there are parallels between Jesus' story and the Jacob and Esau story, the Laban story, but also the Joseph story. So lots and lots of these 388 words are actually tracking onto parts of Genesis. But it isn't just that they map Genesis, they also have a moral. Because you remember how Joseph had a lot to forgive. His brothers had stripped him, thought about killing him, then put him in a pit, then sold him into slavery, and Joseph forgave his brothers. And here we have the older brother who won't forgive. In fact, there's another time in the Bible that we get embracing and kissing, not running, embracing and kissing. And that is when Joseph meets his brothers. When Joseph meets his brothers, and when he's revealed who he is to them, eventually he then embraces and kisses them. In other words, Jesus' story is challenging them deeply. It's challenging these older brother people that in Genesis, people who had been cheated out of their inheritance embraced and kissed. People who had been sold into slavery by their brother embraced and kissed those who had sold them into slavery. This is a huge challenge to forgiveness, to acceptance. It's an amazing thing. So it's not just that Jesus has references, literary references to Genesis, it's that the references have a practical application, a challenge behind them. Then we look at this. There is in the Joseph story in Genesis an interruption in Genesis 38. Joseph's story begins in Genesis chapter 37. Then we have in chapter 38 an interruption where it's all about Judah and Tamar. Then it goes back to the Joseph story. And in that interruption, which is linked with the Joseph story, we get the only other time in the Bible that friend, goat, and prostitute come together. So remember how the older brother said, I never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, came, you killed the fatted calf for him. Now, how does the older brother know that the younger brother has been with prostitutes? The answer is he doesn't know that. It's just comes from his imagination. And why does it come from his imagination? Because that's what he would have wanted to do. Because when the younger brother was away, the younger brother was not sending back postcards saying, here I am with prostitutes. In fact, he hasn't even seen the younger brother since he's come back. He doesn't know he's been with prostitutes. That's just what he imagines. Now, he condemns his brother for sin. Just like in Genesis 38, Judah, who thought that Tamar was a prostitute and had sex with her, and then when she was pregnant, he said, she's guilty, let her be burnt. And then she sends the signet ring and the identifiers that are his and says, I'm pregnant by the man who these belong to. And then he says, oh, actually, I will let you off. You know, I mean, I'm guilty. So what's so striking about that is Judah condemning her for sexual sin when he was the guilty one. That's exactly what's going on here as well. The scribes and Pharisees are condemning tax collectors and sinners for sins that they're guilty of as well. Who are the clients of any prostitutes amongst the sinners? Well, probably some of the scribes and so on. And what we see is this reminder of a young goat and his friend that are prostitutes brings you back to this passage. Now, a little bit more, because in Genesis, Joseph went to a far country and resisted sexual temptation. Potiphar's wife, he resisted. Meanwhile, Judah stayed in the country of Canaan and fell into sexual temptation. So again, it's a very powerful aspect to this story that if you meditate on it, you see that it should convict the scribes and Pharisees of sin. Now, there's a lot of lessons from Judah. Judah condemns Tamar, but he has to say, actually, she's more righteous than me. But then we have in the story of the prodigal son that the younger son comes back and says to his father, this is the third paragraph on this slide, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I have sinned. And in the Hebrew tense that we have in Genesis 44, in Genesis 43, when, and any scribe would know this, when Judah said, I will bring Benjamin back, he said, he said to Jacob, I will bring Benjamin back. He said, I will have sinned, or it could be translated, I have sinned. If I don't bring him back, I have sinned. So when a scribe hears these words, if they are to make a connection, there's a verbal link between what the younger son says and what Judah says in the book of Genesis. Now, in the book of Genesis, Judah, later on, as a reformed character, someone who's left his sin behind, or he's gone on a better path, when he thinks that Benjamin is going to be taken as a slave, he says, okay, he says to Joseph, not knowing it is Joseph, he says, take me as a servant, take me as a slave. And so what we see is a real contrast. Just as the younger brother said to his father, treat me like one of your hired servants, at least that's what he intended to say. He never actually ended up saying it. In the book of Genesis, Judah was prepared to offer himself as a servant. And in Jesus's story, the older brother complained at having to serve or slave for his father when it was the older brother himself who owned the farm. So in other words, all of these details, when you meditate upon them, convict scribes of sin. But there's more. It's not just the story of Laban and Joseph and Jacob and Esau. It's also the story of Abraham. You see, a man had two sons. Yes, Isaac was the only man to have only two sons, but Abraham was pretty famous for having two contrasting sons, the older son Ishmael, the younger son Isaac. That's pretty striking. And in this story of the prodigal son, you have this father. And of course, Abraham is the archetypal father. He's called Father Abraham. 3 times he's called Father Abraham in the very next chapter. He's the father who holds a feast. He also begins his speech in Genesis chapter 18 with quick. So the very first word in Greek from the father's mouth in Luke chapter 15 is not addressed to the younger son. It's addressed to his servants, where he says, quick, there is no time to lose. As fast as possible, we need to have the fatted calf and robes and ring and everything like that. That, of course, is what you see in Genesis chapter 18. There are 3 mysterious visitors who come to Abraham. This is the very first entertainment that happens in the Bible, the very first feasting that happens in the Bible. And this is what we read. Abraham went quickly to the tent to Sarah and said, quick. That's his first word. 3 seahs or 3 measures of fine flour needed to make cakes. And Abraham ran, notice that word ran, and to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the man who prepared it quickly. So lots of words for speed there, quickly, running, and so on. Now, what we should notice here is that all of these things are picked up in Jesus's parables. Firstly, this is the first time in Genesis 18 that anyone runs in the Bible. So if you're a scribe and you're used to copying out the Bible, you remember the first time you come across the word run, it's Abraham running. Oh, he's the first person offering hospitality in the Bible. He's the first person to say quick in the Bible. He begins a speech with quick. And it's the first time a fatted calf is mentioned in the Bible. All of those things come in Genesis 18 and come again in Jesus's parable. Then we see that he's the only other old person to run in the Bible. Abraham is really old when he runs in this story. So when you read of this old father in the story of the lost son, then you think, actually 2 lost sons, you think there is a link there. What's more, he begins the speech with quick, that leads to the fatted calf. It's not just that there is the word quick and there's the word fatted calf, there is a link from one to the other in both the father's speech in Luke chapter 15 and in Genesis chapter 18. And we know that the next thing in Genesis 18 is 3 seahs of fine flour. Well, just as quick comes in Jesus's longest parable, 3 seahs of fine flour comes in Jesus's shortest parable in Matthew chapter 13. And this is where it says, the kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 seahs of flour till it was all leavened. Now, I've spoken about this before. Look at the word seah, S-E-A-H. In the Bible, it's only there associated with flour and the number 3. So it's a striking thing. We know Jesus often took the numbers in his parables from the Old Testament. This is a case. So we've got lots of evidence of Jesus meditating on this verse. Now, in the story of Abraham, the younger son, Isaac, inherits everything. So it's different from Jesus's parable. But how does he inherit everything? Well, because Abraham is the only father to give away his inheritance while he's still alive. This is what happens in Genesis chapter 25. Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. Not he left all that he had to Isaac, he gave it while he's still alive. But to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, sent them away to his son Isaac eastward to the east country. So if you're a scribe, you know the Bible, the story of a father with 2 sons giving his inheritance away while he's still alive, which is an unusual thing to do, but a possible thing to do, should remind you of Abraham. Now, also for Abraham, there's a similarity between the brothers. You see, remember that how the older brother was angry and refused to go into the feast. Well, the older brother in Genesis also refused to go to the feast for the younger brother. This is what we read in Genesis 21. And the child, that's Isaac, grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman for her son, with her son, for the son of this slave woman will not be heir with my son Isaac. We don't know what would have happened if Ishmael hadn't laughed, but we can say this. Ishmael, despising the feast for the younger brother, led to Ishmael's disinheritance. And that is an extreme challenge, because in that way of reading the story, you see that if the older brother despises the feast for the younger brother, that is a very, very precarious position to be in. And if scribes and Pharisees despise tax collectors and sinners coming to Jesus, that's a very risky position to be in. So there's also a contrast. You see, Abraham is the father who would not allow his son to go into a far country. The longest chapter in all of Genesis is when he sends his servant off to find a wife for Isaac. That's Genesis chapter 24. He says, see to it that you do not take my son back there. So there's a story, but there's one more, the story of Cain and Abel. The Bible's first brothers. A man had two sons. What does it remind you of? Well, Adam had more sons, but he was the first guy to have two sons. And this is the Bible's first family conflict. The older brother associated with a field, the younger brother caring for animals. And the older brother getting very angry when the younger brother was accepted by the God figure, by God in the Old Testament, or as it is in Luke 15, a father figure who is very aligned with God. It's the Bible's first recorded anger. The Bible's first recorded anger is envy of a younger brother. Isn't that a striking thing? And there, again, the father figure, God, in Genesis chapter 4, graciously engages with and talks to the angry older brother. Now, of course, the story of Cain and Abel is shorter. There's less link there. But what I find utterly astounding when I think about it is that basically Jesus has worked bits of all of Genesis's greatest hits, all of the narrative stories of Genesis from chapter 4 through to the end, into one simple story. And that simple story makes sense even if you don't notice any of these levels. But what he's showing to the scribes is, scribes, I know the scriptures better than you. I wrote those scriptures. And you need to think about them because they challenge very, very deeply. Each of these figures has a moral challenge in their own story. So some of the connections I've made are more tenuous. I'm fine with that. They're more tenuous. And maybe some of them, a lot of them, the scribes wouldn't see. But some are quite clear. The ring and the robes of Joseph, that's even standardly mentioned as a cross-reference in the margin in Bibles. The running and embracing and kissing of Esau embracing Jacob, that's, to me, is very clear. The Jacob saying, I've worked all these years slaving for Laban, again, that's very clear. And with Abraham and the fatted calf, again, I think it's a very clear reference. And so in addition to those, there are dozens of other references throughout Genesis, some of which are turned on their heads. And so this is a very, very clever story. I don't know of any story as clever as this. And look at the moral challenge. You see, Esau lost his entire inheritance and forgave his brother. Laban lost almost all his property and made a peace treaty with Jacob. Joseph, whose brothers sold him, forgave them. Ishmael's, whose brother inherited everything, he was ultimately at peace with Isaac. What are the lessons for the scribes? Well, Joseph forgave them. He forgave the older brothers who, and also he preserved them. He actually made it so that they get their inheritance. There's a phrase in Genesis where it says that I am here to preserve you from being disinherited. Esau was cheated out of everything and forgave. Laban lost his property. Ishmael lost inheritance through despising his younger brother, and Abraham was welcoming. All of these figures have a challenge in them. There are many more things we could say about it. So what can I conclude? It's a unified, simple story. It's not made by a committee. You can't make a story like this by committee. It has to be made up by someone who knows the Old Testament very well. You say, well, how do we know it was Jesus? Couldn't it not have been Luke making up the story? Well, let's put it this way. It has to be someone who knows the Jewish scriptures better than almost anyone ever. to make a story as good as this. In fact, probably it would help if you had written the Jewish scriptures. What's more, the story has to be handed down with integrity. It can't be one piece comes from a later editor, one piece originates from Jesus, because again, committees don't make brilliant stories like that. The references to the Old Testament are not superfluous. They're actually making powerful points. And it looks like, to put it in a strong way, Genesis, the book of Genesis, was designed with many purposes, but one of its purposes to prepare the raw materials for this story. Now, if that's a way of looking at things, that is quite creepy. That's quite eerie, because it means that the person the scribes are having to engage with is the person whose words they copy out as their daily job. That's a very, very challenging thing. So that's the session, and I'm going to stop sharing screen and back over to you for some questions.
Great, thank you. Our first question asks, do you really think the Pharisees and scribes were able to understand these connections to the Old Testament events that you just presented? And if so, why would they seek to ruin Jesus rather than repent?
So firstly, I think the answer is no. I just don't think they got it. I think the trick is this. They probably think Jesus is a buffoon. He's just telling a simple story. Some of them may not hear. This is why I begin with a call to hear. Jesus says, listen. In fact, the very last word of chapter 14 is the word listen. So that's what they should be doing. And what it says is the scribes, the tax collectors and sinners in chapter 15, verse 1 are coming near to hear Jesus. So the thing that a Jew does every day is they say the prayer, "Hear, O Israel." So they're doing the right thing. And it says that the scribes and Pharisees grumbled. So I think the scribes and Pharisees were grumbling. They had plenty of reason to despise Jesus. And I think probably they missed almost everything. I mean, I'm not saying they didn't spot any of it, but they probably think they're smarter than Jesus. They go away thinking they're smarter than Jesus. You know, we've been to scribe school for longer than he has. We've copied out the Bible more than he has. Whereas what there is for those who are humble enough to listen, to meditate on it, to hear it, there is so much. And it should make you fall on your knees and say, the creator of the universe is talking to me. The person who wrote the books I write out professionally is here. I need to shut up and listen. So I think some of these things, the Abraham reference, the Esau reference, I think they spot, but whether they do anything with it, whether they see the whole, I don't think they do. So I think there is this tendency for us just to underestimate what Jesus has. And I think we do it all the time. We think, a lot of the time when the Bible is read, people who've been going to church for a long time just switch off. We know that story. We know what's in it. We don't need to listen. And so the challenge here is really to listen and listen anew each time and see how uncomfortable it makes us. And I think there's just a lot more in this.
Thank you. Our next question asks, do other ancient Near Eastern literature display anything like this level of complexity or simplicity?
I don't know of any. I mean, I do think that the parable of the prodigal son, or the parable of the two sons, is a very powerful piece of literature. It's inspired so many works of art and so on. And to some extent, you can look at its power, how many sermons are preached on it, how many people have come to faith through it, to say what else is doing that. So I do think it's Jesus' longest story. It's just an awesome story, and I think it's quite superlative in that sense. And I don't know of anyone else who's as clever as Jesus. No, I think just in terms of the documentary evidence, I haven't seen any writer as smart as Jesus. I mean, not that he was a writer, but in terms of the words left to him, by him to us, I don't know of anyone as smart.
Great, thank you. Next question asks, are we trying to correlate these teachings to the Old Testament, or should we be reading them and taking them as a simple teaching?
I think we should take them as a simple teaching. The parable is a really simple parable. If you're running away from God, turn around. If you're begrudging your brother, repent. So it is very simple, and people can overly complicate things, and I don't want to overly complicate things, but I think it's like a snowflake. A snowflake you can look at in its simplicity and beauty, and you can look at its crystalline structure and be utterly awed. And I mean, like what we discover through science, when you look at the science of a flower, shouldn't make you think that the flower is less beautiful. So I think that what we see here is deep structure with beauty and simplicity at the same time. It's all there. That's real smartness. I also think that we are meant to meditate on the scriptures, turn them over, and in our minds. And as we do so, we will see more things, which again are challenging things. These are not things for us just to enjoy the look of. They're actually, for Joseph to forgive his brothers is a really huge thing. And so that in itself is a very challenging story.
Thank you. Our next question asks, is the way Jesus teaches a kind of a code to reach the elect and then blind the rest?
I do think that there is some justification in that sort of way of thinking. I mean, Jesus talks about things are told in parables in order that people may not understand, and yet, of course, the parables do explain things too. So there is this division that comes with Jesus, where often common people hear him gladly, and intellectuals turn up their nose at him. I mean, this is a very common thing, and so Jesus does not adapt his speech to the intellectual etiquette, the refined ways of speaking, and so that is going on, and he has intention. At the same time, we've got to remember that this parable ends with an open invitation to the older brother. The father goes out to see the older brother and says, everything I have is yours, and he calls him child. There is this warm invitation that if the older brother is prepared to eat humble pie, and that's a bad expression, but to humble himself and accept his younger brother, they can be a happy family and have the most awesome celebration. So I do think that God is calling intellectual elites to himself, and they need to respond. So yeah.
Great, thank you. This question asks, do you have any practical applications for preachers today?
From the way Jesus teaches, I think it's important to be simple, and also to head to the moral heart of things. So as with Jesus's question of why do you do this? Where he's getting to the moral sense when he calls people to hear, he's getting people to a moral heart, and also with this parable. So I think we need to recognize humans are moral agents. And so with preaching, the aim is to move people towards God. At the same time, I think there is a need for a deep meditation on the scriptures. So I think Jesus meditated on the scriptures very deeply. So I think we shouldn't view him as having a shortcut to deep Bible knowledge. From Luke chapter 2, where he's quizzing people, that the experts in the temple, he gains his Bible knowledge through hard work. And so I think it's a challenge to us to see that there's more in the scriptures and to meditate on them more.
Great, thank you. Our next question asks, how important are the historical and cultural contexts for Jesus's teachings?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that sometimes people can overemphasize historical and cultural setting, and it can lead to a sort of Gnosticism, which says you can't really understand this teaching unless you join our knowledgeable group that knows all about the secret culture that is, and then suddenly the cultural keys fall out. And I think that's unhelpful. And there are several reasons it's also wrong academically. Firstly, the Gospels themselves are some of our best evidence of Palestinian Jewish culture. So if you look at them plus Josephus, that's plus a bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's the main text we have written from the time. So the New Testament is probably a quarter of all of the Jewish literature of the time we have. So that means that the New Testament actually tells us things about culture, which you can get. And also for the Old Testament is the best guide to Old Testament culture. And people often go to ancient Near Eastern languages, and they're really worth learning. And they go to less well-known languages than Hebrew in order to clarify Hebrew. And so I think you need to be quite cautious about this. At the end of the day, the Bible is a really good interpreter of itself. And so Genesis gives you a great background for understanding Jesus' story of the two sons. And the story of the two sons is the sort of story that can travel to almost anywhere. You can tell it on any continent and people will get it. So I think that there are some deep problems with what I call backgroundism, where people say, unless you get the background, you go the wrong way. Now, at the same time, I lead a Bible research center where I encourage people to learn the background languages, to learn ancient cuneiform, to dig into the Greek sources. But it's about getting the recipe right. So just as when you use chili powder or paprika, you don't want to use too much or it ruins the recipe. It's the same with background knowledge. That sort of background knowledge is 5, 10, 15% of what's relevant to the interpretation of a passage. It's not the 50, 60, 70%. So I would say that scripture is written with enough internal clues that the 85% or more of what you need to understand the meaning is within the context of the scripture itself. So the best ancient Hebrew corpus is the Old Testament itself. Now, sometimes there's a word that's only there once in the Old Testament. Of course, you can go off to look at nearby languages and see, do they give me some extra clue? Of course, it's useful to read Josephus and find out more about things, but don't underestimate the Gospels themselves. The Gospels are some of the best witness to ancient Passover. We know almost nothing about Passover at the time of Jesus, other than the Gospels and Josephus. Yes, we've got later sources about Passover. So that's, by the way, when people tell you all these sorts of things are wrong in the Gospels, often they're projecting all sorts of background ideas onto the Gospels that are wrong historically. So I would be really quite careful about what against backgroundism. I think it is worth spending 30 years studying the background languages just for the 15% you get. That's fine, because God's worth that much. And even a slight refinement in the meaning of the Bible is really worth that much. But I think you want to avoid saying, you know, it looks like it says this, but really it says that. I think that's something that doesn't pass the sniff test.
Great. I think we'll do one more question.
Yeah, great.
Do you think there is a particular reason why the parallels that you have mentioned all come from Genesis and not from Exodus or a different historical book?
Yeah, I mean, that's just Genesis. I mean, we could start on Exodus. What I have sinned, that's what Pharaoh says. I mean, we could have some fun with another book. And I mean, I think Jesus gives the scribe a run for their money. And I think there's a coherence to the fact they all come from Genesis and they interact. But one could make reference, think of there being other background, and I'm not wanting to exclude that. So I think there's a depth to Jesus's parable. I'm still just learning about it. But he is saying, for any who have ears to hear, he's the guy to listen to. But I don't want to say it's only Genesis. I mean, but it's a good start. I mean, it's a sort of starting book.